They swore before the whole household that she had burned the muniment room to hide her thieving, and the young gentlewoman they branded an incendiary and a forger could have named the man who truly set the fire with a single breath and did not, because the one proof that would clear her lay locked in a strong box in London to which she alone held the key, and she did not yet know it. Rosalind Merrow was 26 years old and gently reared and poor, a lady in all but fortune and a servant by necessity, earning her bread as the keeper of the library and the muniment room and the copyist of the estate's papers in a cold, exacting, ancient family in a great house at the head of a northern dale, and on a raw bright morning in the autumn of that year the whole weight of that house came down upon her at once, when the muniment room where the family's deeds and settlements were kept was found gutted and black with a fire lit in the night, and the newest and most important deed of all burned to ash, and the household, one after another, turned its eyes upon the friendless young woman who kept the keys of that room and had copied that very deed, and had no one in the world to speak for her. She had not lit the fire. She had loved the quiet ordered room and the old papers she tended, and would have flung herself into the flames to save them. But she was poor, and alone, and a stranger of no family that anyone there need respect. And the man who had truly burned the muniment room, and taken good care that the blame should fall exactly where it fell, was the smooth, plausible, indispensable man of business of the house, Mr. Crispin Loach, a poor kinsman who managed all its affairs and stood, by the turn of a single deed, to inherit a great part of everything, and who had fired the room himself to destroy the one paper that stood between him and a fortune, and framed the copyist to hide the crime and to be rid, into the bargain, of the one person under that roof whose dead father had once held the proof of his earlier fraud. And so Rosalind Merrow stood accused before them all, confined a prisoner, her name a byword for a thief and an incendiary, faced with the very real shadow of the gallows. And she could prove nothing, and no one believed her, and she did not yet know that the plain worn drawing case she kept always by her father's last gift, a shabby old box of dead tools that Crispin Loach and all that cold house passed over as beneath a thief's notice, held folded behind its faded velvet lining the one key that could unlock the strong box in London where her father's careful love had hidden both the proof that she was no forger, and the proof that Crispin Loach was, nor that the cold proud man who ruled that house, and who had at first believed the worst of her with the rest, would be the one to fetch that truth up into the light before a magistrate and the whole assembled household on the very day her ruin was to be made complete. It was the middle of October, and the dale was going brown and gold under a hard clear sky, when the fire was found and Rosalind Merrow's world came down. And that gray autumn is where the turning of her story begins, though the crime that made it necessary had been weeks in the quiet making in the mind of Crispin Loach. I have been waiting a long time to tell you Rosalind's story, the burned deed and the false accusation and the smooth schemer who meant to see her hang for his own crime, and the plain worn case of a dead man's tools by her side that held the key to it all, and the cold hard man who first believed her guilty and then came to see her true, and to break the frame that had been built around her. So settle in, and stay close by her side through what is coming, because a young gentlewoman who has been called a thief and an incendiary before the whole household she served, and shut up to wait for the law, and made to feel the gallows' cold breath on her neck with no friend to speak for her and no proof she can lay her hand on, is about to find that her gentle, foreseeing father saw the danger long before it came, and left her, folded small behind the lining of a thing no schemer would ever trouble to search, the means to undo the whole false design. And what she does when at last the strong box is opened and her own truth is read out before the very people who thought they had her ruined is a thing worth staying for to the very end. But to understand how a gently reared young woman came to stand accused of a crime she never dreamed of, in a house where she had served faithfully and been trusted, you have to understand what had been done to her, and how it was possible, and who did it. For the cruelty of her story turns on a thing that has ruined more honest servants than any open violence ever did. The ease with which the poor and friendless may be made to bear the crimes of the plausible and powerful, and the readiness of the comfortable world to believe the worst of anyone who has nothing. She had not always been poor, and that is the first thing to know of her, for it made the fall so much the harder to bear. She was the only child of Mr. Beese, Ambrose Marrow, a gentleman of the middling sort, a man of no great estate but of real learning and a warm and honest heart, who had lived quietly in a pleasant house in a cathedral town and had spent his modest means and his whole strength upon the thing he loved, which was the careful and honest measuring of the land. He was a land surveyor and a maker of maps and plans, but more than the common run of either, for he had a deep knowledge of his craft, of the theodolite and the chain and the drawing of a true plan, a shrewd exact eye for a false measure, and above all an honesty that would not be bought. And though he was never rich, for he did much careful work for little, and would never put his name to a survey he did not believe, he had made himself, in that one field, a man whose word on a doubtful boundary was worth more than another man's oath and many a grander man's swagger. He had married for love a gentle, delicate lady, and had lost her young, when their daughter was but 7, and the loss had grieved him deeply and turned him tender and careful. And thereafter he had bound himself more closely than ever to the motherless girl who was all he had left of the wife he had loved. He taught her himself, far beyond the common run of a girl's schooling. She worked with him over the great sheets of plans, and learned to know a true thing from a false one, an honest plan from a doctored one, the marks and the little honesties by which a careful hand reads the truth of a drawing. And she grew into a young woman of unusual cultivation and discernment, quiet and grave and deeply taught, with a clear steady eye and a habit of looking at a thing until she understood it, and a modest reserved manner that hid, from all but those who knew her well, the fine trained intelligence beneath. She was no fine lady to be idle and admired. She was her learned father's pupil and fellow worker, and had learned from him, without knowing how much she would one day need it, to see clearly and keep her own counsel and trust the evidence of her own careful eyes above the loud opinions of the world. And her father, knowing that he could leave her little, had given her, in place of a fortune, 2 things that he believed would serve her better, a mind and a skill that could earn their bread with credit anywhere, and one plain precious thing that he charged her, very gravely, to keep always by her. For Ambrose Marrow in his last years knew that he was failing, and though he faced it without bitterness, being a man of sense, he was uneasy, in a way he could not quite name, about a world in which a portionless gentlewoman of no family and no protector was a creature strangely without defense, at the mercy of any powerful person's malice, with no one to take her part. And so he had done, quietly and in his last months, a careful thing, the most careful thing of his life. And I will come to it, for it is the hinge of everything. He gave her, near the end, the one thing he charged her above all to keep, his own old drawing case, the worn shagreen box of instruments he had cherished all his working life, the compasses and dividers and ruling pen laid each in its faded velvet bed. And he bade her keep it always by her and never part with it. And he told her, holding her hands and looking at her very gravely, that it was more than it seemed, and that if ever she were in a true extremity, alone and wronged and without other help, she was to lift the little tray and look beneath the velvet where he had shown her once, and do exactly what she found there written, and trust it, and tell no one until she must. She had thought it, at the time, only the tender fancy of a dying father who could not bear to leave his motherless girl unguarded, and she had not looked, being in no extremity then, only grieving. But she had kept the old case faithfully ever since, and she would have need of it now. For her father died when she was 23, of a slow decline, and left her very poor. And Rosalind Marrow, who had never had to think of money, found herself alone in the world with a little furniture and her father's books and instruments, the small savings gone, and the plain hard necessity before her of earning her own bread. She met it, as she met everything, quietly and with courage. She had no near relations to turn to, and no fortune, and no protector. But she had her cultivation and her fine trained hand and her good name and her steady sense, and she did the only thing a gentlewoman so trained could decently do. She sought, and after a little while she found, a respectable upper situation, a place as keeper of a great library and orderer of a muniment room and copyist of old papers, in a household that wanted just such a person, gentle and skilled and cheap, to set its neglected archives to rights. And the household she came to in the late spring of that year was the great house of the Stearns at the head of the northern dale, the seat of the Viscounts of Ellingham, and there, all unknowing, she walked into the place where her ruin was waiting. The family she came to serve was an old one, cold and proud and much reduced, clinging to its ancient consequence in a house too large and costly for its shrunken means. The head of it was Julian Stern, the young Viscount Ellingham, a grave, hard, silent man of some 35, who had come young to a burdened title and spent his manhood in the cold hard business of keeping the old name from going wholly under. His father, the late lord, had been dead but a 12-month, and it was the late lord's last great act, and the settling of the estate he had left behind, that lay at the very heart of everything that was to come. For the old Viscount, in his final year, grieved by the ruin his forebears' extravagance had brought upon the name, and resolved that what could yet be saved should be made secure past all reach of waste and grasping hands, had caused to be drawn up and duly signed and sealed a great new deed of settlement, a strict entail of the chief lands, that fixed the descent firmly upon his own son and the son's heirs, and failing them, upon certain distant but worthy branches of the true blood, and cut out forever the claims of a nearer but far less worthy connection who had long hovered about the estate with a hungry eye. It was the safeguard of the whole house, the old lord's dying provision against the ruin of his name, and it lay, with the other great papers of the family, in the muniment room of the great house, where until it should be enrolled and made wholly beyond recall, it was the most precious and the most vulnerable thing in all that ancient place. And to order that muniment room, and make the fair examined copies of its deeds that the law required, and keep the great library on which the old house's faded learning leaned, was Rosalind Marrow chiefly engaged. She did it well, with a fine trained skill that set the neglected archive to rights as no rough hired clerk had done, and the grave young lord came, though he showed it little, to value her quiet competence and trust her with the keys of that room, so that within a few months the copyist had a place of trust that was to be turned, by a colder head than any in that house, into the very rope to hang her. For she kept the keys, she made the copies, she had the run of the muniment room and the handling of the deeds. And there is no one so easy to hang for a fire and a theft as the one whose hand is on the keys. For over the affairs of that failing house, and over the very deed on which its whole future now hung, there presided one man, and that man was the true author of everything that came upon Rosalind Marrow, and it is time to know him. His name was Mr. Crispin Loach, and he was the man of business, the steward of the estate's affairs, the trusted agent and confidant of the Stearns, a distant poor kinsman of the family who had made himself, over a dozen patient years, indispensable to it. He was a smooth, plausible, comfortable-looking man of about 48, with a soft, grave voice and an air of anxious, devoted care for the family's interests that had won the trust of the whole house. The old lord had leaned on him in all that touched the business of the estate. The young Viscount left the detail of rents and leases largely in his hands, and the household one and all thought Mr. Loach the very soul of faithful diligence. And he was a ruined and a desperate man. For all his comfortable exterior, Crispin Loach had a secret ruin. He was a speculator and a gamester, deep and helpless, and had lost, in wild ventures and at the tables, far more than a steward's fees could cover, until he was sunk in debts, secret and shameful, that he dared not confess and could not pay, and worse, he had, in his need, put out his hand to the very moneys of the estate he managed, and juggled the accounts to hide it, so that a true reckoning would show him not a ruined man only, but a plain embezzler, and a felon. He had kept the surface smooth by borrowings and shifts, But by that autumn he had reached a crisis. One dangerous creditor had grown hard and pressed him, and there was to be that winter an audit of the estate's accounts, long delayed and now insisted upon by the careful young lord, that would strip him bare before the family that trusted him and lay him open to the law. And Crispin Loach saw, with a cold terror behind his comfortable face, that unless he could find quickly a great sum of money, his whole long secret ruin was about to come to light, and with it the loss of his place, his liberty, and everything he had. He needed a fortune, and soon, and there was, within his reach, one way only that a fortune might be had. For Crispin Loach was that nearer, less worthy connection whom the old lord's new deed had cut out and set aside, and he knew it. By the old dispositions his own line stood, after the present lord, to come into a great part of the property, and the new settlement, once enrolled, would sweep that expectation away forever and leave him nothing. But the new deed was not yet enrolled. It lay, single and unregistered, in the muniment room, and Crispin Loach saw with a terrible clearness that one paper only stood between him and everything, and that if once that paper were gone, ash and nothing, then the old dispositions would stand, and the fortune the dead lord had meant to take from him would fall, after all, into his hungry hands. And that paper lay, night after night, in a room whose keys he could contrive to reach. And so Crispin Loach, cornered and desperate beneath his calm, resolved upon the boldest and wickedest stroke of his whole wicked career. He would destroy the deed. He would burn the muniment room in the night, and the fatal settlement with it, so that nothing should remain to prove what the dead man had willed, and the old dispositions that favored him should stand unquestioned, and he would come into the great part of the estate that would cover his frauds and save his neck, and set him up for life. But he was too cold to trust wholly to the fire passing for an accident. For a fire in a muniment room, once thought on, hunts for a hand, and Crispin Loach meant that if ever the blaze were questioned there should be another hand ready to point to, and no shadow of suspicion come near the faithful agent who had labored so for the family's good. He had thought it all out, coldly and carefully, as he thought out everything, and he had seen at once who the victim of that second, subtler crime must be. It must be someone within the house, with the keeping of that room, someone poor and friendless, of no family to make a stir or command belief, someone whose word would weigh as nothing against his own grave authority and the united suspicion of the household, and who could be given up to the law with no one to care. And there was, ready to his hand, exactly such a person, the copyist. The portionless gentlewoman Rosalind Merrow, who kept the keys of the muniment room and had the handling of its deeds, who had, but a little before, made the fair copy of that very settlement and so knew its contents and its worth, who was poor and alone and unprotected, and who would make, in every particular, the perfect incendiary and thief. She was the ideal scapegoat. She might have been designed for it, and Crispin Loach, looking at the quiet, friendless young woman across the great cold hall, felt no more compunction in planning her ruin than a spider feels for the fly, and laid his plans to fasten his own crime upon her. But there was more to it, in Crispin Loach's cold, calculating mind, than the mere convenience of a scapegoat. For it happened, by a chance that seemed to him the very finger of his luck, that of all the friendless young women in the world he might have framed, this particular one was the one he had, on his own account, the deadliest private reason to wish destroyed. For Loach had known the name of Merrow when the new copyist came, and had felt at the sound of it a cold start of alarm, and he had looked, narrowly and secretly, and satisfied himself that she was indeed the child of the late Mr. Ambrose Merrow of the cathedral town, the shrewd, honest surveyor. For years before, in the darker days of his need, Crispin Loach had done a certain piece of dishonest business, a false survey and a forged plan, in the matter of an enclosure of common land, by which he had cheated a whole poor parish of its rights and lined his own pocket, and Ambrose Merrow, honest surveyor that he was, had been called in to check the work, and had seen through the thing and come by certain proofs of Loach's guilt, a letter in Loach's own hand that said too much, and the true measured plan that gave the forged one the lie, and had kept them, and let Loach know that he held them, so that Loach had gone for years in a cold buried dread of the man who could bring him to the dock with a word. Ambrose had died, and never used the proofs, being a gentle man with no taste for vengeance, and Loach had breathed again, thinking the danger dead with him. And now here was the man's child, come of all places into the very house where Loach was agent, and he could not be sure how much she knew, or what her father had left her. It was intolerable, a standing danger under his own roof, and worse now than ever, for she was a surveyor's daughter with a surveyor's eye. The one person in that house who might look at a plan and see what no one else would see. And it turned his cold convenience into a hot private necessity. To frame Rosalind for the fire would not only find him his scapegoat and his fortune, it would rid him forever of the one person who had ever held him in her hand, and lay the old ghost of his crime forever. It was, he told himself, a masterpiece, and he set about it with the cold thoroughness of a man securing his whole future at a stroke. He was in no hurry, and he made no slip. Through the early autumn he laid his ground with a patient wickedness. He let fall, here and there and once or twice gravely to the young lord himself, small quiet poisonous hints against the copyist, that the young woman, for all her gentle ways, had a strange deep knowledge of papers and plans, that a person so poor, with the handling of so much that was valuable, and the skill to copy a hand, bore watching, that in a house where great deeds lay in a stranger's keeping, his lordship would do well to have a care who held the keys. He did it so softly, with so grave an air of mere faithful prudence, that it seemed the very opposite of malice. But he knew the proud reserved temper of his employer, and he knew that he was sowing, in that guarded mind, a slow seed of distrust that might spring up, when the moment came, into instant conviction. And he prepared his physical proofs with the same cold art. He procured a little of the oil and spirit with which the fire should be helped, and hid the empty flask where a search should find it. He took, by a small easy theft, a spoiled sheet of Rosalind's own copying, and, more deadly still, he had made ready, by his own not unpracticed skill in a false hand, a half-finished counterfeit of a valuable document, done as if by her, that should be found among her things and seemed to show she had been forging the family's papers for her own gain, and had fired the muniment room to hide the theft. He held these by him, hidden, against the night when the deed should burn, to plant where a search must find them, in the room where she slept and among the papers she kept, so that the fire should look plain and damning, like the guilty work of the woman whose hand was on the keys and who had every reason to burn the room and cover her forgery in the flames. And he chose his moment, and he made it. On a black windy night in the middle of October, when the household slept and the wind off the fells would fan a blaze and cover a stealthy step, Crispin Loach let himself, by a key he had long since contrived to have, into the muniment room, and he took out the fatal deed of settlement, and looked at it once by his shaded lantern, and thrust it deep into the papers he had piled and drenched, and he set his fire cunningly, so that it should seem to start from a chance spark among the dry old documents, and burn fierce and quick, and destroy the deed and the room before it could be got under, and then he went softly away to his bed, and left it to burn. And burn it did. The alarm was raised in the small hours, and the household was roused in terror, and there was a wild confusion of running feet and shouted orders and buckets of water flung upon the flames. But the muniment room was well alight before ever it was seen, and the old dry papers burned like tinder, and though the fire was beaten out at last before it took the whole house, the muniment room itself was gutted and black and ruined, and the deeds it had held were ash, and the newest and most precious of them all, the old lord's last great settlement, was gone, wholly gone, burned to nothing as if it had never been. And Crispin Loach, standing grave and busy and helpful among the rest in the smoke and the ruin, with a face of proper horror and concern, saw that the thing was done, that the deed was ash and his fortune safe, and set himself at once, coldly, to the second half of his design, which was to see the guilt of it fastened, plain and sure, upon Rosalind Marrow. For when the fire was out, and the gray morning showed the black ruin of the muniment room, the question came at once: how had the fire begun, in a room of papers kept locked, whose keys were held by one person only? And Crispin Loach was ready to let others find the answer he had laid for them. He was grave and reluctant and full of a show of unwillingness. He said that he would not believe ill of anyone, but that the room had been locked, and its keys held by the copyist, and that his lordship would remember he had more than once, from a mere faithful anxiety, hinted that so much value in a stranger's keeping bore watching. And the young lord, his mind darkened by the loss and long since touched by the agent's whisperings, and the plain fact that only one person held the keys of that room, turned, with a cold sinking, toward the copyist, and the word ran through the house that the muniment room had been fired of set purpose, and that the young woman who kept its keys must answer for it. And then Crispin Loach, gravely, as one performing a painful duty, suggested that in fairness to all the copyist's room and her papers should be searched, and the search was made, and among her things they found the empty flask of spirit that any hand might have placed there, and, worse, the papers Loach had planted, the spoiled sheet of her copying, and the half-finished forgery in a hand made to seem like hers, that seemed to show, plain to every eye, that the copyist had been forging the family's papers for her own gain. And that was the end of Rosalind Marrow, so far as belief or mercy went, for there was the flask, and the forgery, in what seemed her own hand. And what more could any reasonable person want? The find was taken for certain proof, and the young lord, cold with anger and loss, accused her to her face, before the assembled household, of being a forger and an incendiary he had taken into his house, a beggarly nobody who had abused his trust to forge his family's papers and fired the muniment room to hide her thieving. And Rosalind Marrow, struck to the heart, white and trembling, denied it, steadily and truthfully and with all the plain force of an honest soul. She had not fired the room, she said. She had loved the old papers and would have died to save them. She had forged nothing and knew nothing of the flask nor the wicked paper they showed her. She was no thief and no incendiary. But she said it into a wall of cold disbelief, for the household had already made up its mind, and her very skill with a pen and her poverty and friendlessness, that should have moved them to doubt, were taken instead as the proof of her guilt. And so the whole cold house closed against her, united and satisfied and pitiless, in the settled conviction that the poor copyist had forged the family's papers and burned the muniment room to hide her crime and been justly found out. And here, before I tell you how far the ruin ran and how low the world brought her, I must ask one thing of you, because everything in Rosalind's story is about to begin, quietly, to turn, and I would not want you to miss the turning. If you've made it this far into Rosalind Marrow's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. There, that is the only time I will ask. Now stay close by her side, for she is about to be more alone than she has ever been in her life, and to learn how little the truth is worth to a comfortable world that has already decided against the poor. And she was very much alone in it, which was the bitterest part of the whole bitter business, for there was no one in that cold house or in all the country round to whom she could turn or who would think to doubt. The tale ran out into the neighborhood before the day was well begun, carried by the servants and colored by Loach's grave, regretful tongue, and it lost nothing in the telling. The poor copyist, the beggarly nobody the good young lord had charitably taken in, had repaid her master's kindness by forging his family's very papers and then burning down the muniment room to hide her thefts, and had been caught with the forgery in her own hand. And the comfortable world that heard it believed it, easily and at once, as it always believes the worst of those who have nothing. For a forger who is poor and friendless and has, moreover, the dreadful cleverness of an educated hand, is the most natural thing in the world, and no one need trouble to look twice. The great ladies of the county, who had thought the surveyor's portionless daughter a very good sort of person while she was useful and quiet, discovered now that they had always felt there was something not quite to be trusted about her. "I am never deceived in a face," said Mrs. Prudence Gorse, a plump, complacent lady who had never in her life looked below one, nodding over her tea. There was a boldness in that young woman's eye, for all her still ways, and a deal too much cleverness of the wrong sort. I own I never liked it. And handsome cold Lady Cassandra Mead, who had a way of pitying people cruelly, said it was very shocking, but that one really could not wonder that these decayed gentlefolk who set up to be clever were always the worst, made dangerous by a little learning, and that it was a lesson against trusting one's papers and one's confidence to such persons at all. Not one of them thought to ask whether the thing were even true, or whether a friendless creature found guilty in an hour on a flask and a paper were not the very person a real criminal would choose to hide behind. They had their culprit and their comfortable thrill of horror, and they turned their backs, all of them, and left Rosalind Marrow to her ruin, so that she learned in that one day how solitary a wronged creature may be who is poor, and has no name that anyone need respect, and no one at all to believe her. And Rosalind Marrow stood in the midst of them. Ruined, she saw the whole shape of the thing that had fallen on her, though she did not yet know the hand that had built it. She saw the flask in the steward's palm and the false paper held up before her, and the cold certainty in every face and the impossibility of making one's soul there believe the truth. And she understood, with a sick sinking of the heart, that she was lost. That her word was worth nothing against that damning find. That she had not a friend in the house nor a proof in the world, and that she stood, a gently reared and honest woman, branded a common forger and incendiary before them all, with disgrace certain and the gallows a near and dreadful possibility, for it was no light thing, in that age, to be taken for the firing of a great house and the forging of deeds. Arson and forgery alike were hanging matters, or at the least the hulks and transportation beyond the seas, with no mercy for a friendless servant caught firing her master's house to cover a theft, and the shadow of that dreadful end lay cold across her from the first. She was not turned out, as a mere careless servant might have been. She was worse placed than that, for hers was a capital charge, and she was confined, shut up under lock and guard in a cold upper room of the great house, to be kept close until the magistrate could be sent for and the law set in motion and she carried off to the county gaol to await her trial. She was a prisoner, disgraced and broken, shut up alone with the certainty of her ruin and the near dread of the rope, with nowhere to turn and no one to believe her and the brand of a felon upon her forever. And she had, though she scarcely thought of it in that first black hour, one plain worn thing that they had not thought to take from her, that no one had thought worth the taking. One last gift of her father's love and his life's work, waiting by her for exactly such a day as this. For she had, always, the drawing case. It stood among her few poor things, where the searchers had turned it over and tossed it aside. Her father's old case of instruments. The worn shagreen box with its brass corners and its faded velvet beds, the compasses and dividers and ruling pen laid each in its place, the tools that had drawn 1,000 honest plans. It was the last gift of the father she had loved, and the dearest working thing she owned, and when, in the search, the servants had turned over her few poor possessions, hunting for stolen papers and the signs of forgery, they had glanced at the shabby old box of dead tools and tossed it by. For what was a dead surveyor's case of compasses worth to people hunting the proofs of a fire? It was beneath their notice, and beneath Crispin Loach's, who reckoned everything by its danger to himself and saw in the worn old case only a keepsake of no account. And that contempt, though none of them knew it, was exactly why it was safe. But as Rosalind sat in her locked cold room, in the first dreadful stillness after the storm, her thoughts went, as they always did in her trouble, to her father. And there came back to her with a strange new and piercing weight, the thing he had told her long ago, in his last weeks, and that she had put by as a dying man's tender fancy and never thought of since. He had held her hands, she remembered, and looked at her very gravely, and said that the old drawing case was more than it seemed, that if ever she were in a true extremity she was to lift the little tray and look beneath the velvet, where he had set something for her, and to do exactly what she found written and trust it. She had thought it then, only the sweet sad anxiety of a father who could not bear to leave his motherless girl unguarded, and had not looked. She had never been in any extremity. But she was in a true extremity now, wrong past all bearing and alone and shut up to answer with her life. And sitting there in the cold locked room, her father's grave face rose before her, and his strange words. And she thought, with a sudden trembling of the heart, he said something beneath the velvet. He told me to look, in a true extremity. And I am in a true extremity now. And here I must tell you the thing, that neither Rosalind nor Crispin Loach nor all that Cold House knew, the careful secret thing Ambrose Marrow had done in his last months and told almost no one. For it is the hinge of the whole story and the answer to the perfect frame. In the last year of his life, knowing he would leave his only child poor and friendless in a hard world, he had resolved to leave her, against any evil day, one hidden line of defense that no ordinary malice could reach. And he had, moreover, never forgotten Crispin Loach. He had the proofs of Loach's old fraud, the letter in Loach's own hand and the true measured plan that gave the forged one the lie, and had kept them by him, and in his last illness he had had a careful surveyor's instinct that those old proofs of a living cheat's guilt ought not to perish with him, but be preserved, safe and ready, in case they should ever be needed against the man. And so he did a quiet and careful thing. He made, with his own hand, a fresh dated memorandum of the whole fraud he had detected, plain for any honest man of his craft to confirm, and he gathered certain vouchers of his child's good character, and he lodged the whole, sealed up, in a strong box with an honest and independent London firm of his own choosing, the old and careful house of Wenlock and Prior, wholly unconnected with anyone who might one day wrong her, with a solemn charge that the box be given up to none but his child or one bearing the token he named. And the token, and the key to the whole, he had hidden in the one place no schemer's hand would think worth searching. Beneath the velvet tray of his old drawing case he had set a slip of thin paper in his own hand, giving the name and street of that London firm and the number of that sealed box, and a word of direction, that this was her surety against any evil day, and that she was to open that box if ever she stood in need of what it held. He had hidden her vindication and a cheat's ruin beneath a bed of faded velvet, and then had died, trusting that if ever the worst came she would remember, and look, and be armed. And there was one thing more, that neither he nor she could have foreseen would matter so, but that her own methodical care had put in the way of her deliverance, for Rosalind herself, following her father's teaching, had lodged in that same safe box, some weeks before, the one spare fair copy she had made and examined of the new deed of settlement, sent up for safekeeping as a careful copyist keeps a duplicate of a great instrument against loss, so that, all unknowing, she had placed beyond the reach of any fire the very thing the fire was lit to destroy. And the worst had come, and for a while in her grief she had not remembered, or had remembered only as a sad sweet fancy, until now shut up and branded and desperate. She remembered her father's grave face and his strange words, and her thoughts crept to the worn old case among her poor things, and she thought, he said something beneath the velvet, and I am in a true extremity now. But before she could look, and before I can tell you what came of it, I must bring into the tale the man who was to be, though neither of them could then have dreamed it, the breaker of the frame and the answer to her ruin, for on that very day of her disgrace, all unknowing, the cold master of the house was drawn, by the ugliness of the thing done under his own roof, out of the settled anger in which he had first let her be condemned, and to understand why he, of all that hard household, was the one who would not in the end let the wrong stand, and why he came to see the truth when everyone about him was so sure of the lie. You must understand who he was, for the world had him quite wrong, as it usually has such men. Julian Stern, the Viscount Ellingham, a man of some 35, was reckoned, by the county that knew him a little and liked him less, a cold, hard, proud and disagreeable man, grave and silent and unsmiling. with a level dark eye that gave nothing away, and a short way with fools and a shorter way with anyone who presumed on him. A man who kept himself apart and asked no one's love and seemed to care for nothing in the world but the cold, hard struggle to keep his ruined house from falling. Cold as the fells, said the neighbors, a hard, proud man with no heart in him, wrapped up in his acres and his pride. And all of it, as such verdicts commonly are, was the truth turned inside out. For the Viscount was not heartless, he was only proud, and reserved, and worn hard by long trouble, and honest past the point comfortable society finds comfortable. He had come to his title young, to an estate already half ruined by his forebears' extravagance, and had spent the whole of his manhood in a grim, lonely, unthanked struggle to save it, denying himself everything, laboring like his own steward, carrying alone the crushing weight of a great name and a small purse, and he had, but a year since, buried the father he had honored, and taken upon himself the finishing of that father's last great work, the making secure of the old name against ruin, of which the burned deed had been the very keystone. It had made him hard, and silent, and old before his time. It had shut him up in himself and dried the show of feeling out of him. But it had not killed the deep, honest heart beneath, nor the stern sense of justice that was the bedrock of him, nor the reverent love he bore his dead father's wishes, nor a capacity for a deeper feeling that he had shown to no one and all but forgotten in himself. He could not abide a lie, nor a cruelty, nor an injustice. He had a plain, stern rectitude that was the one luxury his poverty had left him, and though he was cold with anger and loss at the ruin of his father's great deed, and had, in the first horror of it, half believed the copyist guilty with the rest, for the evidence seemed plain, and the agent was sure, and the loss was bitter, there was in him, beneath the cold surface and the anger, something that would not quite lie easy, some stern, honest instinct that was troubled, from the first, by the thing that was being done. For Julian Stern, cold and stricken as he was a just man and a noticing one, and even in the anger of that dreadful morning, something in the business had jarred upon him and would not be still. He had looked, once, hard and searching, at the accused copyist's white, steady face as she denied the charge, and he had seen there not the brazen falsehood of a guilty creature, but a plain white shock and a steady, truthful denial, and a proud grief for the burned papers she had tended, that did not fit, to his stern reading, the guilt they laid on her. He had marked, too, with a faint cold unease, how very pat the evidence was, how neatly the flask and the false paper had been found, and how zealously the agent's grave hints had prepared them all, and he remembered with a slow cold stirring that it was Loach, and Loach alone, who had first turned the talk toward the copyist, urged the search, and known just where suspicion should fall. He put these things by in the first press of his loss, but they lay in his stern, honest mind like small stones in a shoe, and would not let him be. As that dreadful day wore on, and the first blind heat of his anger cooled into a searching displeasure, the trouble in him grew rather than lessened. For his stern soul could not endure that an innocent creature might be hanged or transported while the true criminal went free and, worse, profited by it. He resolved, coldly and privately, that before that young woman was given up to the law he would look into the matter with his own eyes. For a just man, he thought grimly, owes that much even to a suspected felon, and everything to his own dead father if that father's last work had been destroyed by some other hand than the one they had seized. And in this he was confirmed, that very afternoon, by the one honest outside voice that reached him, for old Mr. Ezra Godfrey, a shrewd retired attorney of the district who had known the neighborhood 40 years, and had drawn the old lord's very deed, and had no love for the smooth Crispin Loach, came to the house on hearing the news, and said bluntly to the Viscount as one plain man to another, that he had known many a rogue in his long time, and that this quiet young gentlewoman did not sort with any of them, and that he for one would want far better proof than a flask in a room and a paper any clever hand might have written before he hanged a friendless creature on the word of Crispin Loach, of whose own honesty, he added grimly, he had never thought so highly as the family did. The Viscount said little, but the plain good sense of it, from a man he respected who had no interest to serve, struck home and hardened his stern unease into a settled resolve. And there was one thing more that moved him, though he scarcely owned it, and it was the memory of the woman's face. He was a lonely man, starved in the deep hungers of the heart, though he had long forgotten it. And something in the still white proud endurance of the accused copyist, the way she had stood alone in the midst of them all and denied the charge and grieved for the burned papers and asked no pity and did not break, had reached some deep buried place in him that had not been touched in years. He put it from him. He told himself it was nothing to the purpose. A mere idle fancy at a time of trouble. But the face went with him. The grave gray steady eyes that had met the whole cold house without flinching, and it sharpened his unease into something almost like a personal need to know the truth of her. And so, moved by his honest instinct and his stern justice and his reverence for his dead father's work, the cold Viscount of Ellingham did the thing no one else in that house would have troubled to do, and that broke, in the end, the whole cold frame. Before she was given up to the law, he sought the accused woman herself, and looked at her, and listened, and gave her, alone of all the world, the chance to be heard. He came to her in the cold upper room where she had been shut up to wait for the magistrate, and he came alone, and closed the door, and stood a moment looking at her with his hard, unreadable eyes before he spoke. And Rosalind, worn past fear by the day's dreadful blows, rose and faced him steadily, expecting nothing but a fresh reproach. The master come to curse the woman who had burned his father's deed, and she was startled past her guard, when instead he said, in his level quiet voice, that he had come to hear what she had to say for herself, plainly with no one by, that the evidence against her was heavy, and he would not deceive her that it was not, and that his father's last work was destroyed and someone had destroyed it, but that he was not wholly satisfied, and would hear the truth from her own lips. And he bade her, gravely, tell him whether she had fired the muniment room and forged his papers, and if she had not, what she knew and thought. And something in the plain stern fairness of it, in the unlooked-for justice of the cold hard man who alone would hear her, broke through Rosalind's proud reserve and her despair. And she told him the truth, steadily and simply and with the plain ring of an honest soul, that she had not fired the room nor forged one line. That she had loved the old papers she tended and would have given her life to save them. And above all the great new deed, which she knew for the safeguard of his house. That she knew nothing of how the flask and the wicked paper came among her things. And that she was as innocent as the day, and could prove nothing, but that it was the truth before God, and she would say it though it cost her her life. And she said too, one thing more she had scarcely dared to think, that the counterfeit that was to damn her was, to her trained eye, no work of hers, but a clever imitation of her hand by someone who had studied her copying, and that there was but one man in that house who had daily seen her hand and the coolness to ape it, and that was Mr. Loach, who had first thought of searching her room and had so long dropped his little words against her, when he alone had never shown her anything but a smooth civility. And the Viscount heard her out, in a hard attentive silence, weighing her words with his stern clear judgment, and when she had done, he was silent a long while, and then said, slowly, that he believed her. He had come, he said, half persuaded of her guilt, with his father's work in ashes and his heart against her, but he had watched liars before, and honest folk, and knew the difference. And he did not believe that the woman before him was a forger and an incendiary. And if she were indeed innocent, he told her quietly, then a horrible wrong was being done and the true destroyer of his father's deed went free and had profited by it, while an innocent woman was to hang, and he would not suffer it to stand if there were any way on earth to come at the truth. And he asked her then, the question that unlocked everything, whether her father, of whom he had heard as a man of skill and honor, had left her nothing, no paper, no provision, that might serve her in such a strait. And Rosalind's thoughts flew, of themselves, to the worn old drawing case among her poor things, and she remembered her father's grave face, and his strange dying words, and she told the Viscount, slowly, of the old case of instruments, and of what her father had said, that if ever she were in a true extremity she was to lift the tray and look beneath the velvet where he had shown her, and do what she found written there, and trust it. She had not looked, she said. She had thought it, in her grief only a dying man's tender fancy, but she was in a true extremity now. And Julian Stern, who missed nothing, went very still, and said in a low careful voice, that a careful loving father who bade his daughter look beneath the velvet of his own case in her last extremity did not, in his experience of men, speak idle fancies, and that she should look now, before him, that they might see what her father had left her. And so the worn old drawing case was fetched from among her poor things, and there, in the cold upper room, with the grey autumn light failing at the window, Rosalind Merrill lifted out the little tray of compasses with trembling fingers, and eased up, with the point of her father's own bodkin, the faded velvet that lined the bottom of the case, and beneath it, folded to the size of a fingernail, pressed flat all those years against the wood, was a slip of thin paper, covered in her father's small careful hand. And she unfolded it, her fingers not steady at all, and read again, and lifted to the Viscount a face gone white and blazing with a wild new hope. For on that slip her father had written the name and the street of a London firm, the house of Wenlock and Pryor, and the number of a sealed strong box lodged there, and the words, "My dearest child, if you are in need or in any wrong, send to this house and open this box. Herein is your surety, and proof against the man who would harm you. Trust the bearer of this token, and be not afraid." Her father had reached out of his grave to arm her, and the cold Viscount, reading over her shoulder, understood at once that here was a thread to follow, and the stern trouble in his hard face kindled, for the first time since the fire, into a cold fierce purpose. For here, at last, was the thing that might break the frame. Here was the thread that no one else had troubled to seek. Julian Stern saw the whole shape of it in an instant. He did not yet know what was in that London box, but he knew that a careful honest man, who bade his daughter open it in her last extremity and called it her surety and her proof against one who would harm her, had put something there of weight, and he resolved, on the instant, what must be done. The box must be opened, quickly, quietly, and lawfully, and whatever it held must be brought north and used, before this cruel business was made final and the innocent woman's ruin sealed past mending, and his father's true will left defeated forever. And he did a thing then that showed the whole stern quality of him. He did not give her up. He went, that very hour, to his astonished household and to the agent, and told them, in his quiet unanswerable way, that the copyist should not be sent to the county gaol nor given to the law, until he had satisfied himself of the truth of the matter. That his father's deed was destroyed, and he would be very sure of the hand before he let any creature hang for it. That he was master in that house, and would answer for it. And Crispin Loach, when he heard of it, felt the first cold breath of a fear he had thought impossible, and set his smooth wits at once to work to undo this dangerous clemency and hurry the thing to its end. But the Viscount was immovable, and he kept the accused woman in the house, in a grave honorable custody, safe for the while from the worst, and he set about, with his cold thoroughness, the fetching up of the truth from London. He did not go himself, for his sudden absence, with his house in such an uproar, would have been marked, and would have warned the guilty, and he meant to stay and hold the ground and watch. But he had a grave, shrewd, entirely trustworthy man of his own, an old servant named Gideon Marsh, who had served the Viscount and his father before him, and was devoted past all buying. And him he sent posting to London that very night, armed with a letter in the Viscount's own hand and the token, for the firm, her father's slip said, would give up the box only to his daughter or one bearing her authority and the token he named. And Rosalind, by the Viscount's advice, sent a line in her own hand claiming her father's provision, and, for the token, the little slip itself in her father's writing, that the honest firm would know. And so Gideon Marsh went south, hard and fast, through the cold October nights to find the London house of Wenlock and Pryor, and satisfy that careful firm of the justice of the case and the truth of the token, and have the sealed box opened before a notary as the law required, and bring back north, with all the speed of the fastest post, whatever it held, and it was a business of some days. For London was far and the roads hard and the forms must be observed, and those were hard days at the great house on the Dale, for the household buzzed and wondered, and Crispin Loach plotted, and Rosalind waited in an agony of hope and dread, and the Viscount kept his stern watch, and held them all off, and let no one see the fierce anxiety with which he too awaited the word from London on which an innocent woman's whole life, and his own dead father's true will, now hung. And Crispin Loach in those days knew at last the taste of fear, and grew desperate, and began, for the first time in his long smooth career of crime, to make the small mistakes that desperation makes. He could not understand the Viscount's obstinacy. He had counted on the thing being over in a day or two, the forger seized and carried off and himself safe, the deed ash and his fortune sure and the way to it clear before him at last. And this dangerous delay, this keeping of the accused in the house and this sending of a trusted man on some secret errand, filled him with a cold creeping dread that his masterpiece was somehow going wrong, though he could not see how. He tried, smoothly and urgently, to press for the wretched business to be finished and the law let take its course, and to turn the young lord's anger against his kinsman's strange clemency. He redoubled his grave hints against the copyist. He even ventured to hint that the master's odd tenderness for a clever forger might itself become a scandal. But the Viscount met all his smooth urgings with a cold level look and a short word that Loach found he could not pass, and worse than that, the agent began to feel, in the Viscount's hard watchful eye, a cold new attention turned upon himself that he liked not at all. And so, baffled and frightened, he fell back on watching for what the master meant to do, and on holding himself ready, if the worst came, to fly. He had reckoned every visible piece on the board, the woman's poverty and friendlessness, her clever hand that made her the plausible forger, the burned deed, the planted flask, the false paper, the united suspicion, the ruin made sure, and found the reckoning perfect. But he had overlooked one thing, because he could not see its worth, a shabby old case of a dead man's compasses among a poor woman's things, that a dead surveyor's love had made the key to a strong box, and that held, beneath a bed of faded velvet, the undoing of his whole cold design. He never thought of the drawing case at all. That was his error, and it was enough. And here, while the days of waiting wore on, I must tell you what those days did, quietly, beneath the great business of the plot, to Rosalind and to the cold Viscount, who had become her one defender. For the breaking of the frame is the turn of the story, but the heart of it is the two of them. And I would not have you miss it. They were thrown much together now, in the strange grave intimacy of her danger and her defense. For the Viscount, having taken her cause in hand, would come to her in those days to tell her what word there was, or that there was none, because he found, to his own cold astonishment, that he wished to. And in that close hard fellowship of trouble and hope and shared purpose, for they had, each of them, a stake in that London box, her life and his father's true will, the grave silent Viscount and the proud reticent copyist came, without ever once saying so, to know each other to the bottom, and to be, each to the other, the one true thing in a false and cruel world. He found in her a mind and spirit he had never looked to find, a cultivation to match his own buried love of better things, a clear brave sense, a fine discernment that read a false hand as another might read a false face, a courage under wrong that shamed the softer women he had known, and a gentleness the cruelty done her had not soured, and she, who had thought never again to trust any creature in that house, found in the cold hard master not the pride the world saw, but a stern deep honesty, a lonely starved heart like her own, and, beneath the grave surface, a capacity for a gentle feeling he had shown. She began to see, to no one living. Each, in the other, found for the first time in a long starved while someone who understood. He was too proud, and too honorable, and too careful of her helpless state, to speak a word of love to a woman who was his prisoner and whose rescue lay in his hand. He would have died before he used her extremity to press a suit upon her. But she felt it, in his grave care, and the way his hard face gentled when he looked at her, and the fierce quiet anger on her behalf that broke sometimes through his coldness, and she knew in her own heart, with a wonder that steadied her through those dreadful days, that she was coming to love him too. This cold, clear, honest man, who had believed her when all the world condemned her and set his whole strength between her and the gallows for no reward, and the knowledge, unspoken between them, was a warmth at the center of the cold, and held them both. Word came from London on the 5th day, and it was better, far better, than even the Viscount had dared to hope. Gideon Marsh returned, gray with hard travel and grim with a triumph he could scarcely contain, bearing the strong box's whole contents sealed up under the notary's hand and the firm's, and Julian stern. Opening them in private with Rosalind at his side and his stern face for once alight, found in them not one weapon but 3, and each was a thunderbolt in its turn. The first was Rosalind's own vindication, her father's plain written account and vouchers of the honest facts of her life, enough to establish past cavil her good character. A shield of proven respectability to set against the brand of a forger. The second was the ruin of Crispin Loach, and it was the very key to the wrong that had been done. For there, in that London box, kept these several years by the foresight of the honest surveyor who had never forgotten a cheat, was the whole clear proof of Crispin Loach's old and secret guilt, the letter in Loach's own hand, written years before in the matter of that false survey, that said far too much and betrayed the whole, and Ambrose Marrow's own dated exact memorandum, setting out the history of the fraud he had detected, and, most deadly of all to a forger, the true measured plan of the enclosure in the dead surveyor's own unimpeachable hand, that gave the forged plan Loach had made the plain flat lie, and proved to any honest man of the craft that Crispin Loach was and had long been a forger and a cheat. And the third thing, and it was the one that turned the whole fire to nothing, was Rosalind's own doing and not her father's at all. The true examined fair copy of the great deed of settlement, the very paper Loach had burned, that she in her methodical care had lodged there for safekeeping weeks before the fire, so that the old lord's last provision, that Loach had risked everything to destroy, was not destroyed at all, but lived, whole and provable, in a strong box in London, and could be set up again and enrolled and made final in the teeth of all his crime. And the Viscount, reading it all with his hard clear head, reached the truth in a cold blaze of certainty, that the very man who had turned suspicion on the copyist, and urged the search, and known where the false paper would be found, was himself a proven forger of years' standing, who had fired the muniment room to destroy the deed that beggared him, and framed the innocent woman to hide his crime and be rid of the one person who could expose his old guilt. He could not, in that first hour, prove every step of the fire with a paper, but he had proof enough of Loach's old forgery and his motive and his lies to break the frame utterly, clear Rosalind, and turn the whole force of the inquiry, with a magistrate behind it, upon the true culprit, and he had no doubt that once the hunt was turned upon Loach the rest would follow, the doctored accounts and the debts and the whole dreadful truth, and hang the man or send him beyond the seas. Julian Stern looked at the papers spread on the table, the proof that cleared her and the proof that damned her enemy and the very deed his father's would-be destroyer had thought to burn, and then he looked at Rosalind's white blazing face, and for the first time in all their acquaintance something like a grim and terrible resolve settled in his hard eyes. He had his weapons now, he had them whole, and he had only to choose the time and the manner to strike, so that they should do the most complete and the most public and the most final work, and clear the wronged woman and unmask the criminal before the very household that had condemned her and vindicate his dead father's will. And he chose, with a cold sense of justice almost terrible, to make the exposure absolute and public and past all undoing. He would call the household together, and bring the law, in the person of the county magistrate, and he would have present, to old Mr. Godfrey, who had doubted from the first and had drawn the very deed. And there, before his servants and the assembled house that had branded her a forger, he would produce the proof of Crispin Loach's old guilt, lay bare his motive and his lies, set up the saved copy of the burned deed before their eyes, and clear Rosalind Merrow's name in the sight of all who had blackened it, and set the law upon the true criminal at the very moment of his fancied safety. It was a stern plan, and a just one, and it asked of Rosalind a little more patience, a little more of the hard waiting she had borne so long. But she had courage, and she trusted the grave man who had become, though neither of them yet spoke of it, so much more to her than her defender, and she held her nerve, and waited for the hour. The day came, a hard bright autumn day with the light lying clear and pitiless over the great house and the brown fells beyond, and Julian Stern had made his quiet preparations, and brought his people together in the great cold hall, and had the county magistrate present, a solid, upright, sensible gentleman named Sir Cuthbert Vane, whom the Viscount had privately begged to attend on a grave matter touching the honor of the house and the doing of justice and the destruction of his father's deed, and who did not yet know the whole of what he had been brought to see. And old Mr. Ezra Godfrey stood grave and watchful at his side, brought to confirm with his honest knowledge of the law and of the deed he had drawn what the dead surveyor's papers set out. The household was there, the servants ranged and murmuring, all agog at this strange solemn summons in this grave presence of the law. And Crispin Loach was there, smooth and grave and outwardly composed in his sober man of business black, but with a cold sick fear gnawing beneath his calm, for he could not tell what this meant. And every instinct of the hunted schemer in him was screaming that something had gone terribly wrong. And Rosalind Merrow was there, pale and still, brought in by the Viscount's order, standing quietly apart, her father's worn old drawing case for the first time, held openly in her two hands before them all. Outwardly a disgraced woman brought to hear her doom. Inwardly a soul strung tight with hope and dread, waiting for the grave cold man to keep his word. And when they were assembled, and the murmuring had stilled, Julian Stern stood up before them all, in the cold bright hall, and spoke, in his level voice that carried to every corner of it. He said that he had brought them together, and had begged the presence of Sir Cuthbert Vane as a magistrate, because a grave and a horrible wrong had been done in that house, over and above the burning of his father's deed, and he meant to see it all set right before them all, that the young gentlewoman lately accused among them of the forgery and the fire had been, he was now assured past all doubt, falsely and wickedly accused, and that he would show them, then and there, by proof they could not gainsay, both that she was innocent, and by whose hand the true guilt lay, and that the same hand had lit the fire and built the lie. And there fell on that hall a silence like the silence after a thunderclap, and every face turned, and Crispin Loach, by the great hearth, went slowly gray, and gripped the back of a chair and fought to keep his smooth face still. And the Viscount, quite unmoved, turned to the magistrate and to the company and told them all. He told it plainly, and coldly, and completely, and he had the proofs in his hand. He told them first how he had doubted the too pat evidence and the strange zeal of the accusation, and how it was one man who had turned the talk against the copyist and urged the search and known where to look, how he had sought the accused woman out and heard her, and believed her, and how she had put into his hands the thread that led to the truth, her dead father's provision, lodged in a sealed box with a London firm. And then he produced the papers that Gideon Marsh had brought north, and laid bare before them all the whole hidden history how the late Mr. Ambrose Merrow, an honest surveyor of unimpeachable name, had years before detected a certain man in a false survey and a forged plan and the cheating of a whole poor parish of its common land, and had secured the proofs of it, a letter in that man's own hand and his own careful memorandum, and the true measured plan that gave the forgery the lie, and had lodged them at last in the London box, as a protection for his child against the very man, and that the man so proved a forger and a cheat, in his own hand, before them all was. And here the Viscount turned his cold level eyes full upon the grey and shaking agent Mr. Crispin Loach. And he held up the letter, and the dead man's memorandum, and the true plan against the forged, and put them into the hands of the astonished magistrate, and bade old Mr. Godfrey read out and confirm what they set forth. Here was the man who had cried out against the copyist and dropped his hints for weeks before ever the fire was lit, who had urged the search, and known where the flask and false paper would be found, who of all the household had the skill and coolness to counterfeit her hand. And here was that same man proved, by his victim's father, a secret forger of years' standing, with the strongest reason under heaven to see the daughter of the man who held his guilt silenced forever. And, the Viscount added, in a voice gone terrible, with a reason nearer still, for who, he asked them, stood to gain a great fortune by the burning of that one deed, and to lose it forever if that deed should stand? Let them look at the man whose whole inheritance hung on the destruction of the settlement, and who had framed a friendless woman to hide the fire that destroyed it. And then the Viscount dealt the stroke that turned the whole fire to folly, and the whole crime to nothing. For he told them that the deed Crispin Loach had burned, the old lord's last great provision, was not destroyed at all. He held up the sealed packet from London, and told them that the accused copyist, in her careful honesty, had lodged in that same strong-box, weeks before ever the fire was lit, a true and examined fair copy of the whole settlement, that the very paper Loach had risked his neck to burn lived, whole and provable, under the notary's seal, and that his father's last will should be set up and enrolled and made final after all, in the teeth of the crime that had been done to destroy it. And a great gasp and then a great murmur went round the hall, for the fire that had ruined an innocent woman had been lit. They saw now, all for nothing, and the schemer had burned a room and blackened a soul to destroy a thing that could not be destroyed. And then, while they were still reeling from it, the Viscount dealt the last stroke, the one that broke Crispin Loach past all mending. He said that, having doubted the agent in more than this, he had that very morning, quietly and with the magistrate's authority, caused Mr. Loach's own rooms and his private desk and his locked strong-box to be secured and searched, and that there had been found, and he had it brought in then, and set upon the table before them all, the tools and the materials of the very forgery that had been planted on the copyist, the spoiled trials of her counterfeited hand that a forger makes before he perfects his imitation, and the flask of spirit that was the fellow to the one found in her room, and worst of all for him, the doctored account books and the sheaf of his own ruinous debts and his creditors' threatening letters, that showed to all the world the desperate need that had driven him to fire and to forgery for a fortune. And there it lay, the tools of the forgery and the proof of the debts, upon the dark table in the cold bright light, the proof of everything, the guilty craft in the true criminal's own keeping. And a great gasp, and then a great murmur went round the hall, and every eye turned, cold now and terrible, upon Crispin Loach. And the smooth, plausible man, exposed in his own old crime and caught with the very tools of the forgery, and the ruinous debts that named his motive, his masterpiece shattered, and the gallows itself opening before him, lost, for the only time in his hard, smooth life, his cold command of himself. He blustered, and denied, and then, seeing the proofs on the table and the horror on every face turning now against him, he broke, and cried out, and would have fled, but the Viscount's men were at the doors, and Sir Cuthbert Vane, grave and terrible now in his office, laid the law's hand upon him, and Crispin Loach, the smooth schemer who had burned his kinsman's muniment room to inherit and reached to ruin an innocent woman to save his own neck, was taken, then and there, a detected felon, to answer for the whole of it before the law. And it all came out, in the days that followed, the old forgery and the enclosure and the cheated parish, the embezzled moneys and the doctored books, the fire and the wicked frame, the whole cold history of his crimes unraveled at last. And Crispin Loach was carried away to his trial and his ruin, undone utterly, ruined by the one thing his cold reckoning had never thought to search. And Rosalind Marrow stood in the cold bright hall, in her plain gown with her father's old drawing case in her hands, cleared before them all, cleared in the sight of the very household that had branded her a forger and an incendiary. Her innocence proved, her good name restored, the true criminal unmasked and taken, the old lord's will risen whole from its ashes, and the whole cruel frame that had been built around her broken to pieces before the eyes of all who had believed it. The household, that had been so cold and so sure, looked now upon the wronged copyist with a shamed and wondering respect. And some with tears, for they saw how nearly they had helped to hang an innocent creature, and how they had all been played by the smooth kinsman they had trusted. And Rosalind, who had borne so much with so still a courage, felt the long dreadful strain break in her at last, and stood trembling, hardly able to believe that it was over, that she was cleared, that the shadow of the rope was lifted from her, and she lifted her eyes, across all that murmuring hall, to the one face she sought, the grave cold face of the man who had believed her when all the world condemned her, and had set his whole strength between her and the gallows, and she saw in his hard eyes, meeting hers, a look that no one else there could read, and that told her, without a word, everything. She did not fall into the Viscount's arms, and he did not ask her to, and that is the last and best thing to know of them, for it is the whole meaning of her story. She was cleared now, and free, and her good name her own again, but she was still a poor gentlewoman with her way to make, and he the proud master of the house where she had been so wronged, and he was too honorable and too careful of her to press his suit in the hour of her rescue, when she was too newly cleared and too beholden to say him a fair no. He did a thing then, instead, that showed the whole stern quality of him and won her more surely than any wooing could have done. He saw to her vindication being made complete and public, so that her good name should stand clear not in that house only but in the county and the world. He pressed upon her, gravely, such amends as he could make, and would have settled on her a sum that would have kept her in modest independence all her days, and he offered, with a grave delicacy, to help her to whatever future she might choose, entirely as she wished, and owing him nothing. And then, having done all this, he did the hardest and finest thing of all. He set her free. He told her, quietly, that she was cleared, and independent and her own woman, free to make what life she chose, with no claim upon her from him or any other, that he asked, and would take nothing for what he had done, and that if she should ever, of her own free choice, wish to see him again, on whatever footing she herself named, she had only to send him word, and he would come, but that until she sent it, she should hear nothing from him that could weigh, by so much as a feather, upon a freedom he had helped her win. And then he saw her, with grave care, safely and honorably away from the great house that had used her so ill, to a decent lodging in the town and the ordering of her own restored life, and he left her free. And she took her freedom, and she used it, and she found it good. She was no longer the friendless creature who had come to the great house in the spring. She came out of that dreadful autumn cleared and vindicated, and, by the Viscount's amends, modestly provided. A gentlewoman with her good name shining the brighter for the trial it had passed through, and her own life in her own hands at last. She settled quietly, in a pleasant town not far off, among a few old friends of her father's who welcomed the honest surveyor's daughter warmly. She took up again, in a small way, the quiet, careful work that had been her father's gift to her. The copying and ordering of papers and the drawing of a fair plan, for those who valued a true hand, and she drew, for the first time since his death, a free and easy breath in a world that had so nearly closed on her forever. And she thought, in that free quiet time, long and honestly, about the grave cold man who had believed her when no one else would, and had broken her ruin and asked nothing and set her free, and she found, thinking of him with her whole clear mind and her whole freed heart, that she loved him, not out of gratitude though she was deeply grateful, and not out of need, for she needed no one now, but freely, and wholly, and of her own certain choosing, for the stern honesty and the lonely strength and the hidden gentle heart of him, and for the way he had alone of all the world, seen her true and believed her and loved her enough to set her free. And when she was quite sure of it, quite sure that it was her own free heart and not the shadow of her rescue that spoke, she sent him word. It was a short letter, and a grave one, and it said only that she would be glad to see him again, on the footing of two free and equal friends, whenever he should care to come. And Julian Stern, who had waited in a hard patience she never fully knew, came. And this time there was no frame, and no fear, and no false accusation, and no dependence. There were only two proud, lonely, honest souls who had each found, late and unlooked for, the one other creature in the world they could wholly trust and wholly love, meeting now freely and as equals on the far side of the storm. He came, through that winter and the spring that followed, often, and they walked and talked out of the whole of their two deep minds and starved strong hearts. And the love between them, forged in trouble and left to grow in freedom, deepened into a quiet certain thing that needed no declaring and yet was declared. At last, quite simply, one soft evening in the early spring, when he told her, gravely, that he had loved her since the day he saw her stand alone and wronged before them all, and grieve for the burned papers and not break, and had held his peace until she should be free enough to hear it as a free woman, and asked her, not as a rescuer to a rescued but as an equal to an equal, whether she would have him. And Rosalind Merrow, who was mistress now of her own restored life and her own good name and needed nothing any man could give her, said yes, freely and gladly, and of her own full choosing, because she loved him, and for no other reason under heaven, and gave herself, not as a wronged creature rescued nor a poor dependent raised, but as a free woman choosing, the one gift that is worth nothing unless it is given free. They were married in the summer, quietly, and she went to the great house on the dale not as the friendless copyist who had been branded a forger in its cold hall, but as its mistress and its lady, come freely and honored and beloved to the very place of her worst wrong. And the hall that had rung with her false accusation saw her come into it now, on the arm of the man she had freely chosen, as its lady. And the household that had once closed against the forger opened now, glad and ashamed, and loyal, to the wronged lady come to her own, and the old lord's will, that Loach had burned and her own care had saved, was set up and enrolled, and made final at last, so that the very thing the fire had been lit to destroy stood firm forever, and the ancient name was made secure as the dead lord had willed, by the hand of the woman his heir had wronged and then wed, and the great house, that had been so cold and so darkened, grew warm, for the Viscount's long lonely struggle was eased at last, not by any fortune, but by the coming into it of a heart that understood his own. And the two of them, each so long alone, made of that grim old place, and of the ordering of the estate that she took up as its lady, a shared and a happy work, and were, in the deep quiet way of two reserved souls who have found their one true mate, as happy as ever two people were. She lived long and honored and beloved, the once branded copyist of the great house, its lady now and mistress of a great heart, cleared and free and loved, and she kept to the end of her long life two faithful customs that those who loved her understood and strangers did not. She kept always, and used always, and would to her death, her father's worn old drawing case, its hidden slip long since taken out and its secret spent, but the plain box of instruments itself dearer to her than any jewel she owned, for the skill it taught and the father's hand that had used it and the love it had carried and the vindication it had, all unregarded, unlocked, and she drew her fair plans out of it, as her father had done before her, and would take it sometimes in her hands, in quiet moments, and be still, remembering the gentle foreseeing man who had armed his motherless girl against a danger he could only guess at, and hidden her rescue in the one thing a schemer would never think to search, and she set it down for those who should come after her. The whole plain truth of her story, how the friendless and poor may be made to bear the crimes of the plausible and powerful. How a proud, hard man's plain love of justice had refused to let a wrong stand when all the world was content that it should. And how a woman with a clear mind, and a steady courage, and a father's care behind her had, borne a false and deadly brand without breaking, and waited, and been cleared at last, and how there are things a schemer will burn and things he will never think to search, because he cannot see their worth, and the plain worn case a hard man passes over as a dead man's tools may hold the one key that unlocks the strong box where the truth he thought destroyed lies waiting, safe to undo him. And on the one day in all the year that was the anniversary of that cold bright morning in the great hall, when the truth was read out and her name given back to her before all the world, the Lady of Ellingham would go alone, in the evening to the quiet of her own room, and take out the worn old drawing case, and lift the little tray and be still a while, with the memory of her gentle father, and the wonder of her own hard-won deliverance, and the deep sure love of the grave clear-eyed man who had believed her when all the world would have condemned her, and had loved her enough to set her free before he ever asked her to be his. That was the whole of Rosalind's story, the burned deed and the false accusation and the smooth schemer who reached to ruin her, and the father's foresight and the cold master's justice that broke the frame, and the plain worn case of a dead man's tools that held the key when all the visible world was against her. And if you have stayed by her side to the end of it, as I asked you at the first to do, then you have seen the thing I have been waiting all this while to tell you, which is that the truth of an honest soul is worth more than all the evidence a liar can plant against it, and will out at the last if there is but one just man to seek it, and that a good man's foresight can reach out of the grave to arm the child he loves, and that there are things worth more than a schemer can see, hidden in what he passes over, waiting only for the day of need, and so the candle burns low on another tale. Stay a while in the quiet, and tell me in the comments whether she chose rightly.